knowing. How do we do that at the university? We look to that term indigenization, but what does that mean, indigenization? I mean, I remember when the term first came out, there was so much pushback from people. And it was, what are you going to do? Are we going to have to restart? Are we going to have to redo everything? And are we going to put an Indigenous facade on the academy? Well, of course we're not. I mean, that to even think that way is not, it's just not possible. And decolonization, and I have a tough time with that word decolonization, because we have to acknowledge that it's still going on. We are working within colonial institutions. We are looking at ways to make everything accessible to people, but it's not enough for us to make space or room for Indigenous studies or Indigenous participation if we don't motivate ourselves, if we don't have action items, if we don't change it. I mean, we can say we have graduate studies in Indigenous knowledge, but what does that mean? I mean, is that accessible to everybody? It's accessible to a portion of us because we are in a privileged space. I can tell you that when I'm speaking here today, that my sister who works at an Aboriginal preschool, this doesn't resonate with her. I know that. And so when we talk about this, it's ways in which to make this accessible to a different population base. It's how do we reflect what we're doing at the university to reflect what is going on in an Indigenous community. And we need to, when we say decolonize, we need to acknowledge that it's still going on and that it's still going on in terms of the requirements for our graduate studies, that there are language requirements, that there are formatting requirements, that there is a model of how a thesis or a paper should look like. And we need to acknowledge there are other ways of doing those type of things. And so I just wanted to wrap up with that we need to talk about it. We need to acknowledge it. We need to come up with an action plan because quite frankly, 25 years here and we're still in the same place. And I can tell you that 10 years ago, an academic came up to me and he said, I see you at every meeting. And I thought about it back then and I thought, well, I see him at every meeting too, but I shouldn't be the only person that they're seeing at a meeting. And then this past December, another academic from the same faculty came up to me and he said, same thing. I see you at every meeting. And I said, I see you too, but it's not enough just to see just one person. I didn't look through the list today, but I'm wondering how many Indigenous people we have on this list today. And that's not proportional to the Canadian population, not even the university population. So while I want to see more participation, I need to know how we do that. And I know that we have strong allies within the university, but we need to come up with some serious action plans to it. And I'm going to leave it at that for our discussion.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. Those are very useful, important reminders, both of our history and how far we have to go. For our last presenter for this session is Dr. Lorraine Thirsk. She's assistant professor at the Faculty of Health Disciplines at Athabasca University. Lorraine, the floor is yours. I'm not reading out people's bio for a reason, because I know in the last session as well, at the keynote session, we were running out of time. So I'm hoping that this way we will actually save some time and have more time for discussion at the end of the presentations.
Sure. Thank you, Mina. I'm just going to share some slides here just to keep me on track. Should just be a minute here before it pops up. Here we go. Are you seeing that okay? That's all right. All right.
Yes.
Okay. So it is really hard to follow up from all of the wonderful speakers that have gone ahead of me. I think my presentation is going to be a little bit different and have a little bit of a different focus, but I'm here today. I was asked to talk about a project that we have received some funding for, and so I'm going to give a little bit of overview of what's happening in our faculty, in the Faculty of Health Disciplines, and this project. So I am a third and fifth generation settler from Western European descent. I was born in Assiniquojah, Assisipsis, which is also known as Stony Creek or Camrose, and my great-great-grandparents settled land along the Battle River. in Treaty 6 territory, and I'm currently living in Amiskwaskiwakahikan and live very close next door to the Enoch Cree First Nation, as well as the traditional lands of the Papas Chase First Nation. So a little bit about the Faculty of Health Disciplines and our conciliation. For those of you who don't know, we do have 4 graduate programs in our faculty: the Masters of Nursing, Masters of Health Studies, Nurse Practitioner program, and a Masters of Counseling program. And one of the things that really excites me about our graduate programs is because we work with health leaders across Turtle Island here. And so we have an opportunity, I think, to interact with many different health systems and health services. So in 2018, we began some conciliation work within our faculty, and according to the TRC calls to action, identified some need to develop some standalone courses, as well as to integrate Indigenous content to better support Indigenous learners. So we do have both in our undergrad and graduate programs, we have Indigenous learners, and then also to support the education of the non-Indigenous faculty in our programs. We, in our last program review, for example, for the Masters of Health Studies and the Masters of Nursing program, we identified it as a plan that we were going to develop a standalone graduate level Indigenous health course. There is Indigenous content required for our nurse practitioners program. And recently, the Masters of Counseling program had a student, Lee Smith, complete her thesis looking at the need for more decolonization and inclusion in their program. And so I think there is a really large group of us in FHD who are really keen to move some of this work of decolonization and conciliation forward. And so I did read the CAGS report, and the phrase that stuck with me was start, just start and do something. So last spring, I came across this funding call from Health Canada, Addressing Racism and Discrimination in Canada's Health Systems program, What We Do. So several of us in the Faculty of Health Disciplines, along with Myra Tate from FHSS, who was very instrumental in putting this grant funding application forward, we applied to this funding call to develop some educational materials to address racism and discrimination in Canada's health system. So we were successful in this, and we received funding at the beginning of December. I do just want to mention the other people on the project team. So we worked very closely with Nick Scatterman and Priscilla, as well as Power Ed, who's a partner on this project, with formerly led by Jessica Butt-Scott, who's now moved on. And right now, we are in the process of establishing an advisory committee. So, of course, while there are many of us non-Indigenous faculty who are really keen to see some of this work go forward, we know that we need some of this wisdom and guidance from elders and knowledge keepers to help guide our work. So that is the process that we're engaged with right now. So a little bit of the purpose of these courses. So specifically, I think what's compelling me and driving me is I am a nurse, a registered nurse, and the issues that we see with racism and discrimination in the health system really compel me to do this work. So I'm specifically hoping that the set of courses that we were developing will address the TRC calls to action, specifically number 24. So across Canada, fewer than 20% of nursing programs currently have a course that would be suitable to address this call to action. And so we are hoping that we can offer this to our program students, both at the undergrad and graduate level, but as well to non-program students from across the country who need this content. So this aligns very clearly with the CAGS call to action number 4, which is to advocate and mandate for a course on historical implications and contemporary Indigenous realities for all graduate students, and to train students as well as our own faculty and staff in anti-racist practices. So the course, the funding that we got from Health Canada is a scaffolded set of courses. So working with Power Ed, we are going to develop one kind of free micro course, a short 6 to 8 hour course that will be a MOOC style. And then 2 micro-credential courses. These are mostly targeted at working health professionals, so people who've already, been through programs and are maybe looking to obtain some micro-credentials in this area. And then we are also going to develop credit-based courses for both our undergrad and graduate learners focused on health professions and human services. So courses in FHD as well as FHSS. So that is currently our plan. What this funding will help to support. And these are, I guess, that's kind of where we're at currently. And if I can look to the future and kind of based on what I've heard today, these are my ideas for what FHD needs to do within EU to support Indigenous graduate education. So how do we involve and support current Indigenous graduate learners and alumni? So we know that we need to do appropriate consultation and compensation for their work. And have some clear and supportive policies and procedures to support our Indigenous learners as they work through our programs. And then also when we're thinking of these courses and future courses and the development in our faculty, what do we need to do for sustainability and ongoing decolonization? I think, like Priscilla said, it still happens. We're still working very much in colonizing structures and institutional deadlines and things like that. So we know that we need to do some faculty and instructor recruitment and development in our faculty and explore maybe longer term what would some more Indigenous advisement look like in the FHD, so that we really continue to develop this and grow this area. So that's all for me.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. Yeah, that was really interesting, and there was such a lot of complementarity between the CAGS report and what we are hearing here at AAU, especially in terms of some of the longer term goals that CAGS has put forward in terms of sustainability, creating the right space for thriving, and not just including bodies. That's very important too, but also to change the culture. Which creates more supportive structures and policies in place. So we'll open the floor for Q&A. If you have any question, please feel free to put it in the chat, or better still, raise your hand and ask the question. Well, while people are still gathering their thoughts and formulating their questions, maybe I have a generic question for all 3 panelists, and feel free to respond or treat it as a comment. But are there some things that in your journey of thinking about indigenization and decolonization, however difficult and incomplete and partially inaccurate these concepts may be, but is there anything you felt in terms of learning? Like we've heard a lot about this is what we can do going forward, but are there also things that you felt we shouldn't have done or shouldn't do? Is there anything that we can learn from our mistakes, I suppose? Is my question right now while we are still waiting. And I see actually a hand. Sean has raised a hand as well. So I'll give a minute to any of the presenters who would like to comment on what we shouldn't have done as much as what we need to do.
I'll go first. I don't think that it's a question of things that we haven't done, because we wouldn't know if it was going to work or not. And so what we saw in the 80s was the first major wave of students coming in to post-secondary institutions. I mean, and we've seen those different ways. What I see now, I mean, back then it was older students coming in, but what I'm seeing nowadays is students who are following that traditional path of just finishing high school and then going on into university. And I think that has to do with not role models. It's with role models, because if I came from, I went to university at 18, and went straight into it. But I didn't have any family role models to look to. I didn't have anything else to follow that path, that to show me that path. And so at, you're 18, you go to university because it's expected of you, but only if you're enrolled in a high school where it's primarily non-Indigenous, and I went to a non-Indigenous high school, and yeah, and you muddle your way through it, but you don't have a role model that says, oh, you're going to experience this, 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 this. There's nobody there to assist you in that. And so when I think of things that we should have done, I mean, of course, there's always the ifs and the what ifs, but I think that if we're working towards it and we're looking at openness and we are looking at ways to assist students, that's going to be something that we're going to learn along the way. But once again, I mean, I went to university, let me think here now, without dating myself, 35 years ago is when I first entered, and I haven't left since. But along the ways you wish, there are a lot of wish lists on what you could have done and what should have happened, or even forming a relationship. And with Indigenous people, it's forming the relationship. So having no relationships to start with. And now we see a lot of Indigenous associations, student associations. And I know that at AU, we have those with our student unions, that we have Indigenous circles of support where they can go, and that we have Niskatchewan, which needs a larger presence online so people can see themselves. They can see themselves within the university itself. And we have a lot of academics now, Indigenous academics. So you do need role models along the way. And you do need to see that, you're growing up in Slave Lake. What does a university education do for you? Do you need to go to the city for an education? Can you stay in your hometown, in your home territory, if you're living on reserve, if you're not living on reserve? What resources are out there? What supports are out there? So you need all of that. And it's not that we can, paint that big picture that this is what you're going to do, but I can only reflect on what an Aboriginal mentor said to me. And he said, you need to show them a path forward, that you might not get a university degree, but you might want a university certificate, and that's going to ladder into this one, and that'll ladder into this one, and this can be, what you get from it. I know an academic at the U of A who, and I think about her often, and that she was a young girl living in St. Louis who was afraid of university and who was afraid of leaving her community. And so she did her undergrad degree with Athabasca and finished it. And that gave her confidence to do her master's, and gave her more confidence to do her PhD. And now she's on faculty there. So we need people like that, but we need to show that it can happen, that it's not something out of their norm. And they need to know that you don't necessarily just go into professions like police officer, teacher, nurse, that there are other venues that they can go to. There are other occupations that are needed within the community. So there's part of that community capacity building that we are mentoring students, that they have options, that they know how to get there. Because if you had taken me at 18 to say that I'd be doing this, I never would have believed you. And I did not have the parents. My parents knew a university education was important and they pushed me towards that, but I had no clue what that would actually mean. And I also had no clue of what I'd be giving up for it. And that was community, and that was community supports, that I'd be moving to a city and that I wouldn't have access to any of those things. So I don't know if I would have made the same choices back then, but it worked out. And that I still have community contacts. I still get to work with elders and knowledge holders, and I'm forever grateful for that. So I don't know if there's what we shouldn't have done, because we wouldn't have known.
True. Yeah, thank you. Mine was kind of hopefully just a conversation starter, but thank you so much for adding your insights to that, Priscilla. I see Sean's hand is up, and also there's a question from Maureen in the chat. Sean, do you want to go first? And then hopefully Maureen would like to ask a question herself.
Sure, yeah, I'd like to hear some one of the panel members talk about something in terms of, the theme today is really reimagining graduate education, and that needs to be done for this to be a success over the long term. in talking with other grad deans, these kinds of things are really high on our lists. But then when you go down a level to the academy, you've got external examiners who have questions. You've got internal examiners who might have questions. There are some structures in place that force people to think in certain ways. And Priscilla, you mentioned some of our regulations, which we are absolutely urgently going to change, for example, around the thesis format. So there's these sort of rigid ways of thinking in the academy, and I'm wondering if you can give examples of perhaps successes you've had in addressing some of those roadblocks you might encounter, because we do encounter them from time to time. Not all in the academy are familiar with this.
Maybe I'll answer that from the point of view of the task force. So I didn't say it specifically, but many of the task force members were not involved in specifically faculties of graduate studies. So many of them were Indigenous academics working at different levels in the academy. So I would say that the recognition that we need to plan to reimagine education, post-secondary education, specifically Indigenous post-secondary education, is fairly widespread. But one of the other reasons that if you read the task force report, you'll see that we often suggest actions that are suitable for schools of graduate studies, and then secondly, actions that are suitable for CAGs, or that we are calling on CAGs to put in place for graduate education. And it was partly exactly around the issue you've identified, Sean, that it was our feeling that if CAGs as the national body for graduate education starts, for example, to develop statements on the best practices for including elders and cultural knowledge keepers in supervisory or examination committees, if there begins to be a national standard that is disseminated in a different way than if every institution needs to do it themselves. So we are actually encouraging CAGs to take seriously the work of developing these new national standards, if you like, or I'm not sure if that's the best word, frameworks that would permit, and I guess I would say authorize, the kinds of changes that are being advocated in our calls to action.
Thank you, Dr. Reimer. Maureen, would you like to ask your question, or should I read it out? I'm not sure if Maureen heard my question, so I will just read out Maureen's question.
She has
Dr.
no access
Reimer,
to her mic.
Oh, I see. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, in that case, I definitely should read out the question. Dr. Reimer noted reconciliation fatigue, and Maureen is wondering if the Indigenous community within and outside of institutions is feeling this as well in being asked to engage or be involved in reconciliation efforts within institutions. How do we support Indigenous community members to give them capacity to engage in this work?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And actually, my first response to that comes from my own research. I said we were engaging with two, our partners are two Rocky Creek communities in northern Manitoba, but we also have partners such as, for example, the Manitoba First Nations Educational Resource Center here in Winnipeg. And recently, I had a meeting with the director of the unit that we partner with, who said he's new and had never met me. And he, the first 10 minutes of our meeting were clearly his probing to see who we were, what the level of our commitment and willingness to engage in a long-term relationship was. And I think Priscilla talked about the importance of relationship in all Indigenous work. And once we had sort of established the long-term commitment we've already had to our work as a research team in this way, then he was willing have a different kind of conversation, because what he said to me during the course of our meeting is that organizations such as his, like that are approached, he said I think 50, he probably gets 50 approaches a week from educators at all levels who want to do their reconciliation piece or whatever, include it because they know it's important. So he says, while he recognizes that the initial motivations might be good from a lot of people, they haven't done their work, and so they're sort of wanting him somehow to supply what is needed on the reconciliation front for their school board or whatever it is, their department chair, depending on the level you're talking about. So it is a real problem, and that Maureen has identified here. How can you support Indigenous community members to give them capacity to engage in this work? I think reciprocity is a big one here. We can't just go to the Educational Resource Center and ask them for expertise to contribute to us. We need to figure out what we can offer them as well as a reciprocal way of supporting work they're doing that they feel to be important, and forwarding their projects, so that this is part of a relationship. I mean, you don't just take ever, and so that's one way. When you're talking about, for example, as in this case, a professional association, I do think if you're talking about grassroots community members, though, Indigenous community members, we need to ensure that our institutions have policies in place, and that we assume we need to pay those people honoraria for the days that they work with us. And I would say that's also true for example, having elders or cultural knowledge keepers on supervisory committees and examination committees. Many of our colleagues, of course, have full-time jobs in public institutions. Many of these people are not paid by public institutions, so that their work can be contributed in this way. And we need to honor that. We need to recognize the difference, and we need to honor their work by paying them really reasonable honoraria for a day's work. I don't know, those are two, I guess, comments I would have about that, but it is an ongoing issue. I guess the other thing I would just maybe underline is the other, we say in the report, we think it's very important in order to sustain this work going forward that we develop ways of recognizing and using allies. There's a very interesting exemplar in the CAGS report that comes from the University of Saskatchewan that has actually formally developed an allies group and on campus to ensure that at least 50% of the work towards decolonizing the institution, indigenizing the institution, working on conciliation, whatever language you're using, falls to non-Indigenous campus members. And I think that's something we all need to pay more attention to.
Yeah, thank you. Would Priscilla or Lorraine want to add anything to this conversation?
Yes, thank you, Mavis. That is exactly where we were going with the new strategic plan, and that is that you need relationships built on reciprocity and respect, and that we do have a Council of Allies, which has yet to start because we've had another change in leadership, and so we need to move into that. But we have a Council of Elders that works with our elder, a circle of elders, and then we also have a Council of Allies, because that work does need to be shared across the board. And so the Council of Allies that we've formed goes across the faculties and centers, because it should be a shared responsibility, the work going forward. And it shouldn't be an Indigenous person going into a faculty and saying, oh, you need to do A, B, C to get to X, Y, Z. That needs to be something shared. That is something for the greater good and the greater good of the institution. And so that's something that faculties can see themselves reflected in. And so they have a person that they can contact within their faculties. And so we've been working towards that. So I'm looking forward to the next few years, hopefully, fingers crossed, that we will get moving on the plan and that we will have the support of our current leadership. And that includes all of our executive members too. But I know that we have strong allies within the faculties and centers themselves.
Thank you. We are coming to the close of this session. Does anyone have any last questions or comments? Going once. Oh, I see a hand.
Yeah, there's.
AUGSA president. Do they have access to mic?
Yeah, should have.
Hey, please feel free to ask your question now. Oh, they can't access mic.
Sorry for that.
Oh, there you are.
There I am. I got my mic. So I was just curious, I guess. So my knowledge is low, only based on conversations with Indigenous friends. But if we have education perceived as a colonialist artifact, then how are we? So, from my observations, the federal government is trying to push almost a colonialistic implementation onto Indigenous people. So then how do we do that without becoming a residential school where we have a bunch of colonialists trying to design an educational program onto Indigenous peoples without, like Priscilla said, it's just her. How are we not creating that same environment when really education as we know it, as a Western ideology, is colonial? And so I don't really understand how we, as this kind of group or as the people we are, can really, without becoming residential schools 2.0, trying to push a colonial framework of education and masters and doctorates onto a culture and people that are not, like, we're then trying to colonialize them again. And so I don't really see where we're going that's different and how we can maybe avoid the pitfalls that seem to be recurring to me more than just like, I don't, maybe that's why we're not going anywhere from Priscilla's view, is that we really aren't doing anything except for repeating the past, just with different actors. So I don't know the answer. I just wanted to throw it out there to Priscilla. I don't know.
I'm very sorry, but you have asked a very broad question that should take, that is probably the basis of this this conference or workshop that we have. But also, it's a question that doesn't have any simple answers, especially in the very last minute of a session. So, but what I would say, without dismissing this question, what I would say is that first of all, I do believe that things have changed. I agree with you that educational institutions are still built on colonial patterns, but at the same time, education itself is not colonial. Knowledge creation is not colonial. It's just that there are various forms of knowledge creation that this colonial structure needs to make space for. So that is what I feel that process has started. We have a long ways to go. But also from the last 17 years that I've been at AU, I've seen the changes as well. Just in terms of bodies, there are more Indigenous faculty members, for instance, right? And we are having these conversations that are so important to make those structural changes and to ask those very difficult questions. And in this very last minute, because we are already going over time, I'm very sorry. I'm not dismissing a question, but I'm just saying that it's a very difficult conversation that we have at least started. And like the CAGS report said, we have to start, we have to do better, we have to keep going. And all of those things should inform how we approach anything within our fields as scholars, as students, as citizens. Priscilla, I see your hand up. So
Yeah.
I think I should give the last 1 minute each to the three presenters if they would like to add something in response to the last comment.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that there is change coming up, and I can tell you that the next generations have the culture, have